So thank you so much for this amazing introduction. It was really on point. And yes, I will talk about how we can use artist work. We can kind of take inspiration from artist work to kind of shift our perspective about our relationship with machines, and also kind of build a counter narrative that kind of help us to overcome the panic or deal with it better. So in today's talk, I'm going to summarize some of the main ideas that are contained in a short essay that I wrote. It's going to be published in Italian in March, and the title is Conversations with the Machine. And this short essay discusses the artistic use of artificial intelligence, but as the title suggests, my investigation focuses on this concept of the dialogue, and I'm more interested in investigating the process, right? I'm shifting the attention from the actual product, right, of AI-generated artworks to the process of doing art with the machine. In the book, I selected a series of case studies from different periods, starting from pioneering works from the 1950s to arriving to some today's work with generative AI and neural networks. Focusing on this idea of the conversation is, for me, primarily a way to kind of questioning what I call the myth of the antagonistic machine. Now, Carolina just addressed briefly what this myth is. The myth of the antagonistic machine is a centuries-old cultural idea that you know for sure because you encounter this myth. You might have encountered this myth in a lot of not only media studies, but mostly science fiction and literature. And according to this myth, the machine is always framed as adversarial to the human. And there is this very interesting text, an essay that has been published in 2019 by Andres Brockman. The essay is titled "The Machine as Artist as Myth." And in this essay, he summarizes the main ideas of this myth of the machine, the main concepts very well. Basically, he says that the myth of the machine always goes like this. There is a human-made object, right, that is composed of technical elements. It has a function. It performs like by repetitive movement or tasks. And then this object is made to function automatically and partially independently, right, of human intervention. And over time, this object attains an increasing degree of autonomy. This is how the myth goes. The machine may provide interfaces for human interaction, but these interfaces are only there to appease the humans for their play, their enjoyment, or for human-machine conviviality, he says. At some point, the autonomy of the machine becomes threatening for humans, and the narrative tends to not have a precise ending. He says, Brockman says, if it has one, then the story tends to end well for humans because we need hope, right, in the end. And he concludes saying, it is always this one story of something that is human-made, being functional, then gaining autonomy, right? He says, a dangerous, non-lethal form of autonomy, but as you probably have heard in the past, a lot of people are also talking about lethal form of autonomy. A lot of engineers especially have been talking about this existential risk, right, related to AI. So sometimes this form of autonomy is not just dangerous, but it can also feel threatening in a lethal way. So this is how the story, the myth of the antagonistic machine goes. We still are pretty much influenced by this cultural idea. But back to this concept of conversation. Like, what does it mean to have a conversation with the machine? Now, most people would think about chatbots, right? Because we are so used right now to enter in a conversation with AI applications based on large language models, such as ChatGPT and the likes. But here I'm going to use the word conversation in a broader sense. And I am going to refer mainly to the definition of conversation that was laid out by the cyberneticians in the 1950s, cybernetics, and more precisely, a theory called conversation theory. Conversation theory in the context of cybernetics was conceived, was laid out and invented by Gordon Pask. You might have heard of him. Ever heard of Gordon Pask before? He was also British. And he was an incredible intellectual. He was an artist, an engineer, a teacher, an architect, like a polymath in any sense of the word. And he worked all his life on this idea of building a conversation theory. He conceived human-machine interaction as a dynamic process in which the participants always learn about each other. So the core idea is that seeing machines, we should see machines not as just as tools that we use, but as entities that we can converse with, right? So that's how the conversation theory approaches the idea of machines. Now, he applied this idea of building dialogues with machines to many different devices, experimental devices. He had an amazing name for these weird machines. He used to call them maverick machines because they were very unconventional sort of devices. And among these maverick machines, I would like to just talk about one. And this machine is called the Musicaller. Now, the Musicaller, unfortunately, doesn't exist anymore. We just have a few blurry photographs of the machine. It was dismantled, and the components of the machine have been reused for building other machines. But this machine, but we have documentation, and we have the projects, and we have a lot of text also written by Pask himself about the machine. Now, the Musicaller was an incredible machine that was built around and used between 1953 and 1957. So this is one of the earliest examples of what will later become cybernetic art. And this machine was an electromechanical system capable of producing a light show in response to sound. And so it was designed to be used on stage, like during live shows. And the Musicaller basically could enter in a dialogue with a musician, a pianist, for example. And the machine was able to react in real time to the melody played by the musician. And the interesting thing about the machine is the fact that Gordon Pask, along with his longtime collaborator, Robin McKinnon-Wood, and his future wife, Elizabeth Poole, they basically took this strange interactive experimental machine around England for 5 years. And they tested it in theaters and during live shows with different musicians. And they observed the behavior of the machine, of the audiences, and of the musicians live. And also, the interesting thing is that they started to modify the machine over time. This is why we don't have just one date. We have, we know that the machine has been used and modified constantly from 53 to 57. Because they were modifying the machine constantly according to the results, according to what they were observing in the audience. The initial idea was to create a device capable of stimulating sight and hearing simultaneously, so synesthesia, right? That was the initial idea. But after observing the Musicaller for years in action, Pask actually realizes that the strength of the project lied elsewhere. And this is what he wrote more than a decade later, commenting on the experience. In 1971, the Musicaller was already gone. It didn't exist anymore. But in this specific paper, Pask reflects on the experience, and he says, it was clear that the interesting thing about Musicaller was not synesthesia, but the learning capability of the machine. Given a suitable design and a happy choice of visual vocabulary, the performer, being influenced by the visual display, could become involved in a close participant interaction with the system. He trained the machine, and it played a game with him. You know, that's a process that goes both ways. In this sense, he says the system acted as an extension of the performer with which he could cooperate to achieve effect that he could not achieve on his own. Now, this part is crucial. We are going to go back to that later on. This idea of using the machine to do something that you cannot do on your own. It's not about the machine like substituting humans. It's about entering a dialogue, right? And use this dialogue to achieve things that are not achievable in other ways. This is the musicolor diagram that we still have. You see there are a lot of circuits, a lot of feedbacks between the different components. And so the musicolor dialogues with the human being, and it potentially triggers an endless back and forth dialogue between the machine and the human performer. And an interesting detail about how the machine was designed is the fact that the performer can play a music, like plays a melody, and the system reacts, producing lights, right? Because the performer produces sound, and the machine reacts with lights, color lights in different configurations. But if the musician keeps playing the same melody for too long, the same melodic pattern for too long, the machine, Gordon Pask says, gets bored and stops responding. Right? So it is designed to do that. And so in order to reactivate the dialogue, the musician is forced to change, to vary several times, to kind of look for new ways of activating the machine. Right? So he has to kind of try to always find new paths in the context of the dialogue. So the musicolor, Pask says, is a conversational machine. It doesn't only provide a feedback in response to an input, but is capable of organically modifying its reaction as the dialogue is articulated. And another interesting aspect of the musicolor is the fact that, according to Pask and also other people talking about the musicolor in action, the performer was apparently hypnotized by the machine at some point. Pask says that he writes, one performer, for example, tootled away on his instrument from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. and seemed unaware that much time had passed, an hour, he thought, at the most. So after an initial kind of adjustment phase, apparently the musician kind of loses the sense of time, and it kind of feels one with the machine. Pask says, at this stage, the development of rapport, the performer conceives the machine as an extension of himself rather than as a detached or dissociated entity. So this project is a great example of how machines were approached between the 1950s and the 1960s by engineers and artists, and from this moment on, I'm going to concentrate on artist work. Pask is a very peculiar kind of case because he was both. Like, he was a very difficult figure to kind of just like close in just one role. He was an engineer, but also a very creative person. But this is, as I said, it's a great example of how, well before the mass adoption of digital devices, the machine was perceived as a potential creative partner. So it was not about human beings try to infuse intelligence into the machine, just intelligence in the machine, so make the machine intelligent. It was seen as a potential subject, right, that we can kind of enter in conversation with. This specific approach was influenced primarily by cybernetics, as I already mentioned, but also it's influenced by what was happening in the art world after World War II. You know that starting from the 1950s and going on until the 70s, the art world in the West was kind of undergoing a lot of changes, and art was kind of moving away from the object, like the art object, so this closed thing that we can just observe and maybe put on our wall. And so after World War II, we see in art a lot of tendency toward performance, participation, system art, and like in general art that does something, not just objects that are just still there, like also a lot of movement and a lot of performance. At the intersection of these currents, we find, for example, also the work by Nicolas Schoeffer that you can see here. This is one example. This is a kinetic sculpture from 1956. And this is also, like similarly to the Musicolor, this is also a living object in a way, because this sculpture moves and is capable of reacting to sound, light, and motion in different ways. This sculpture was, as you can see in the picture, this was used in the context of a lot of dance shows, and the machine was seen as a dancing robot, not just a kinetic sculpture. So during live shows, the machine could react live to the change of movement in the environment, the change of light, and the change of sound. The machine was designed to react to the environment in a lot of different ways. And this is a quote that I found in an interesting document called Practical Robot Circuits. And this is basically a text that was kind of published by Philips, because Philips was the company that had supplied Schoeffer with the electronic brain of CISP1, like the technical part. And in this text, the author says that the sculpture becomes a living counterpoint. So they were really considering this sculpture as a co-star in the show, like just another performer that could be kind of involved in the show, in the performance. So to sum up, this conversational approach to the machine that was really important for cybernetics really encouraged artists and engineers to establish this conversation. This is particularly interesting for us in this historical moment that we're living in, because today the discourse on artificial intelligence is instead focused exclusively on the supposed ability of the machine to think, to understand, and to create. So we have on one side the computer, which is this kind of inert matter that it's ready to be activated, and it's our task. Human being must do something. We must show our ability to make this matter intelligent. On the other side, we have human on one side, the machine on the other side. And so we have the machine is just waiting there for us to kind of make the magic, right? And to become intelligent. While this conversation idea, this idea of just collaborating with the machine and also be influenced back by the machine is something that I think we should kind of bring back, like the attitude of entering in conversation. Because machines are always like objects of wonder for us, but they are always perceived as rival entities, and this is something that we should kind of maybe, an idea that we should overcome. As Carolina was mentioning, the myth of the antagonistic machine necessarily leads to the master-slave paradigm, right? Because if we are engaged in a conflict, this conflict can only can be articulated exclusively according to this paradigm, and kind of like we only have two possible outcomes. Even we keep the control, right, of the machine, which is, of course, is the slave in this context, or we become slave to the machine. There's this interesting quote about the cultural myth of the robot that Jean Baudrillard, that you all know, wrote in 1968. And he was talking about the robot as a slave and the fact that we tend to perceive the machine in that way. He wrote, "The robot is a slave then, but let us not forget that the theme of slavery is always bound up with the theme of revolt." Right? So the robot, like the slave, is both good and perfidious. It's good as a captive force. So it's good if it can, until it's useful for us. It helps us do things. So it's a good force if it's captive. But it becomes perfidious and dangerous because it can break its chains. right? So that's the menace that is associated with the machine. So even when discussing the relationship between art and artificial intelligence, the kind of like the most recurring question that is asked always concerns the possibility of the machine of catching up with us and surpassing us. And this is exactly what I try to question in the book. One last quote, and then I'm going to just show you a few artworks from different time periods. But this is, I think, another relevant idea that we should kind of think about. This comes from an essay by Luigi Pagliarini. Luigi Pagliarini was an artist and a researcher, and he has been studying artificial intelligence for a long time. Unfortunately, he left this plane of existence last year. But I find that this concept that he coined of polymorphic intelligence, it's very useful in this context. Basically, he says that we need to consider that we are building hybrid form of intelligences as a consequence of using machines on a daily basis and engaging in this deep dialogue with them, even when we don't realize it. He says, if on the one hand we let machines imitate biological intelligence, on the other hand, we cannot avoid imitating some of their behaviors. So this is crucial, like we are influenced by machines in return. We cannot avoid imitating some of their behaviors and consequently initializing an infinite recursive process. So again, we have Gordon Pask's idea of the dialogue that goes forth and back, like potentially endlessly. He says, an infinite recursive process whereby teaching and learning are practically simultaneous. The intellectual feedback that we have triggered with artificial intelligence is a genuine boomerang, he says. He says this is an intellectual Larsen effect that must be taken into serious consideration since it can only play a crucial role in future theories of the human-machine relationship. This was written in a text in 2007. So, my goal in writing this short essay is to kind of recover this and kind of bring back at the center stage this dialogical attitude toward the so-called intelligent machines. This is an attitude that artists, you will see it, have embraced in the past for many years, and this attitude actually continues to persist today, but it's sometimes it's a kind of overshadowed by more spectacular approaches and marketing-oriented approaches to AI, to the so-called AI art. In order to kind of analyze this relationship between artists and machines, that you will see it's often a very intimate relationship, like almost a relationship that it's kind of really similar to the relationship that we build with other human beings. So to kind of explain and analyze this relationship, artists have been using a lot of metaphors. You know, we have been talking about that yesterday also, right? The power of metaphors. Because metaphors are a very effective strategy when it comes to like navigating the sea of changes, right? When it comes to kind of try to get us like to know something new. So in the book, I have compiled like a small catalog of metaphors that have been used by artists in the past few decades. The machine, you will see, is sometimes seen as an alter ego. Sometimes it's a collaborator. Sometimes it's a daughter, a lover, a wild animal to tame. Sometimes the artist considers themselves a teacher or a parent or a gardener or a shaman sometimes, right? So these are all words that artists have been using to describe their relationship with machines. This is the foundational moment of the so-called AI art. Harold Cohen's work is currently in the exhibition that Karina was mentioning earlier at the Tate Modern, so if you happen to be in London, I suggest that you go. That show is dedicated to the very first years of the experimentation, artistic experimentation with media in general. It starts from the 1950s and ends in the 1990s, right? So it's kind of really the precursor of what we are seeing today. And a central figure in this history of artificial intelligence and art is Harold Cohen. And I don't know if this is a coincidence, but there are a lot of British people in this history. He was also British, but he has been working mostly in California for artistically speaking, starting from the 1970s. He has a very interesting biography because he started as a traditional painter, and he was a very successful one. He actually was one of the artists invited to show in the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 1966. So he was a very successful painter, and he was recognized in the art world. But after the Venice Biennale in 1966, he kind of has a crisis. He got bored in a way. He wasn't into painting anymore. He felt unsatisfied. And he decided to accept an invitation to California, and he starts, he was an artist in residence at Stanford University for a few years in the context of the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. He starts studying programming from scratch. Like, he was a painter, he knew nothing about like computers and programming. He decides to learn a computer language, Fortran, and he starts trying to investigate the possibility of building an artificial artist. This is what Aaron was in his mind at the beginning. So Aaron is his alter ego. So, you know, the artist, his name is Harold, the alter ego is Aaron. And Aaron is an electronic drawing and painting machine. In the image, you see one of the versions, because he worked on this project for almost 4 decades. And so we have a lot of different versions of Aaron, and he kept updating the code and changing the machine for several years. Until his death that happened in 2016. The collaboration between Cohen and Aaron, as I said, spans more than 4 decades, and it went through many phases. Now, in the beginning, the software learns just simple shapes. You could think about it like the evolution of the visual and the drawing skills of a child, right? That's another metaphor, of course, but at the beginning, the software is just producing simple shapes, and then increasingly complex one. At some points, Cohen decides to teach the machine some rules of perspective, for example. And in the 90s, it also becomes a colorist. So color is introduced. So it is really an ongoing project. The artificial intelligence that Cohen uses here, this is important, I should mention, it's not generative AI. This is not machine learning. This is symbolic AI, meaning that basically the artist programmed the machine, so everything is in the code. The machine has all the instructions from the get-go. So it's not the kind of AI that we mostly see around us these days. It's another kind of machine learning. And it's also important to stress the fact that Cohen was writing the code himself, like all the time, right? So everything that the machine does is really kind of decided in detail by Cohen. So, but while at first the goal of, here you can see another version of the machine paint, like drawing. And here you can see that human figures and some plants have been introduced. So at first, the goal of this project seemed to be like this idea of creating an autonomous entity that is capable of really simulating artistic activity. But as the years go by, Cohen changes his perspective completely. At some point, he realizes that, I'm going to read the quote. He says, "The whole of my history in relation to computing has to do with a change from the notion of the computer as an imitation human," this is the starting point, "to the recognition of the computer as an independent entity that has its own capacities, which are fundamentally different from the ones we have. So he, after more than 2 decades, he realizes that it doesn't really, it's not important and maybe impossible to kind of really reproduce entirely what we do, right, with the machine. It's far more interesting to kind of investigate the difference between our intelligence and the machine intelligence. So at this point, Cohen really begins to treat Aaron as not as his alter ego anymore, but as a collaborator, right? And so, in fact, in one of the last exhibitions was titled Collaboration with My Other Self. So he starts to really bring back like the human inside the process, and he works on dialogue. He says creativity lays in neither the programmer alone nor in the program alone, but in the dialogue between program and programmer. So we have, again, like in Gordon Park's work, this idea of the conversation with the machine, which is kind of really the exciting thing about working with machines. A dialogue, he says, resting upon the special and peculiarly intimate relationship that had grown up between us over the years. Of course, like, think about like working with an entity. It's not a human entity, but working with this entity and raising this entity for 4 decades. It becomes a friend. Like you can't help build like an intimate relation with the machine. Aaron is not the only robotic entity in art history. We know a lot of other artists have been building machines that are capable of painting, drawing, even sculpting sometimes. But maybe the contemporary artist that comes closest to Harold Cohen's work that kind of updates this idea of mutual adaptation with the computer and humans, and also the dialogue in the painting process, is Song Wen-chung. She is a Sino-Canadian artist. She has been active for more than a decade now. As you can see in the picture, she also works together with a robotic, like painter, right? A robotic partner. And the question that drives her work, you can see another picture of her painting together with the machine. A difference between Cohen's work and this work is, first of all, the kind of AI. I just mentioned that Cohen's work was based on symbolic AI. This is machine learning. So she trains a neural network with some data and then uses the machine. So it's a different kind of AI. And another difference lies in the fact that here you can see there's a performative aspect also. Like Harold Cohen didn't use to show the machine that much. It just showed the pictures, while she is performing live and like painting and drawing together with the machine and reacting in real time. And this is like kind of different. But the question that drives the entire research is kind of really interesting because if you think about it, it's kind of ecological in nature. Like with her work, she's asking, where does the human being end and when does the AI begin? It is possible to use technology as a model for relearning something about ourselves, or maybe learning new ways of cohabitation with non-human intelligences. So the first metaphor is about so in the first metaphor, the computer is a collaborator, right? So that's the first metaphor. The second possible metaphor that it's contained in the book is this idea of the artist as a gardener. This metaphor has been proposed by William Latham, another British artist, and he is considered one of the pioneers in the field of the so-called genetic algorithms. And he has been working starting from the 1980s, more or less. And basically, he worked with algorithms that are modeled after genetics, right? And so he considers himself a gardener because he kind of uses the machine to spawn a lot of different kinds of artificial creatures or artificial plants, if you will, because he is kind of inspired profoundly by the natural world. So plants and animals, but mostly plants, also minerals. And so he uses the machine to kind of like an artificial DNA, right? And so he uses these algorithms to kind of generate these possible creatures, and then he selects them. In this sense, he is considered himself a gardener. He writes, suddenly, I had a computer spawning images at a rate that would have been inconceivable by hand, yielding an abundance found in nature which an individual human mind could never emulate, and a complexity in the mutation generated that was also beyond the human imagination. So here the artist kind of shift from the traditional figure of the creator artist that is completely in charge of the process, and he agrees to delegate part of the process to the machine, right? So this is a difference in how he approaches the role of the artist. He reserves the right to guide the process, to select the direction in which this artificial evolutionary dynamic is developing, but is also accepting the randomness, right, that the genetic algorithm can bring into the process. Another metaphor is about considering the machine as your offspring, like considering the machine a child. And this works especially for artists working with machine learning, because you know that machine learning system must be trained, right? They must be you have to feed data into the machine, and so the machine learns from data. And in a sense, this can be seen as similar, of course, not identical. There are a lot of differences, but metaphorically speaking, you can think about the AI as being a child, right? That you have to kind of teach things to. And you can decide to raise this child differently. So depending on the data that you use, you can obtain a different artificial child. There are a couple of artists that have been using this metaphor. First, there are Salvatore Iaconesi and Oriana Persico, Italian artists, and they have been adopting this metaphor of parenting twice with two different artificial intelligences. One was called Angel F in 2006. That was a very early attempt at this. And the other one is a project called Yakos in 2019. Both of these AIs were exposed to the world, right? You can see here how they are kind of, they are metaphorically bringing the artificial child around in a stroller. And this might seem just fun, but I've seen this in action, and it kind of triggers a lot of interaction with people. Like, people were curious, asking, what is this, what are you doing? And people started talking with the machine and kind of training the machine, like spontaneously. So this is about the metaphor of parenting. This is another project that it's more recent, you might know. There's also another exhibition right now in London by them that it's about this. Again, only Herdon and Matt Dryos, they have been considering AI as their offspring. So we have, they gave birth to an AI called Spawn, and Spawn is a child neural network that is trained on the voices of its family members, and it became part of the musical ensemble. So it's part of the choir, basically. Here we have an artist that uses the metaphor of the artist as a tamer. So the machine is like a wild animal, and you need to find a way to tame the machine and try to kind of retain some control over it. He uses a very interesting concept called meaningful human control. Right? And meaningful human control is the ideal situation. So you have a system that has some autonomy, but you need to find a way to kind of maintain this control. Yeah, and that's it. That was the last metaphor that I use in the book. Then I talk about a little bit about how all this history relates to the contemporary moment. But maybe we can investigate this together with questions, right? Because I end the book trying to also talk about generative AI and prompting, more contemporary aspects, more contemporary ways of approaching AI. But maybe we can do this together with the question. Thank you.